First World War. We're exploring with like an online encyclopedia, exploring about the life of the Rabbanim, and I think it's a very impressive article. I think someone named Akira Usuki would actually write. I think she would take notes from various different great scholars, also from the Ben Tzvi Institute, maybe connected to Hebrew University. So it's a long, detailed article which he has written, so I thought I'll read it out because it's always good to know the history of what actually went on and the science of what actually went on during that period. Now, she actually gives the author gives an introduction itself respectively. Now we're talking about the British mandate for Palestine. I think this article was actually written in the year 1993, if I'm not mistaken. The author starts off: the British mandate for Palestine was legally based upon the mandate ratified by the League of Nations in 1922, but the mandate itself originated from the Balfour Declaration on the 29th of November in 1917. According to the declaration, HM government view would favour the establishment meant in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people. Okay, while the latter part of it stipulates that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. That's what's saying there. The mandate for Palestine, however, changed religious status quo in Palestine under the Ottoman rule, with which was based upon the millet system, assuring non-Muslim communities in empire of automative on the religious and personal matters. Especially the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, was totally reorganized with the coming of the British mandate, because the new rabbinate of Palestine, with two chief rabbis of both Sephardic, from Spanish origin in Hebrew as we say, and Ashkenazim, let's say I think it's a German terminology in Hebrew, was established at that point in time. There were two different chief rabbinates, as we've learned about beforehand. Now, under the Ottoman administration, the Sephardi community in Jerusalem was recognized as a side representative, of Yishuv, respectively. In spite of its, official status recognized by the Sublime Porte, the Sephardi community, that's what we're exploring over here today, gradually lost their exclusive religious and administrative hegemony, and were, over other, kotels, Jewish communities of Palestine organized upon original places. And I think in Jerusalem, during the second half of the 19th century, the declining process of the Sephardic hegemony over other Jewish communities was, in of itself, coincident with the gradual rising of the Ashkenazi community, supported by European, various different organizations, and also of political and social Zionists after the turn of the last century, respectively. That's what's stated over here. We're just using this article. Now, the second page actually states over here. So, in other words, we're just using this article which I found on the internet. I think jstage.gst.go.jp is the actual article itself. In other words, in Jerusalem, the main losers, let's say, were natives over here from this. Muslims, Arabs, and the Sephardis, alike, who lost much of their, privilege, status as, winners. The winners of this was ascendant European, including the Europeans' client population, the Christian Arabs, and the Ashkenazi Jewish community also. So it's actually very intellectual, informative article I actually found on the internet, which I thought I would share over. Now, in the article, the author will discuss all the political and religious, to do with the Rishon Sion, literally the first Sion at that point in time in Jerusalem, who was recognized as a Chacham Bashi, a chief rabbi of the Sephardi rabbinate in Jerusalem. In 1842 it was, by the Ottoman Sultan, I think his name was Abdulmut I, in 1839 to 1861. And secondly, the author is going to describe over here, which we have to say in detail, the relationship in the 19th century in Jerusalem between both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and then between the Sephardim and Eidut Mizrach, which, it's oriental communities of the Jewish communities from Muslim countries, such as Morocco, Persia, Bukhara, Yemen. And finally, the author is going to describe the Sephardi community, that maybe the different robust, let's say, debates that was taking place at that time, which would cause some damage, let's say, in dignity and authority of the Sephardi rabbinate, and it will actually result in the weakening of the Sephardic, let's just say, hegemony, respectively. And now the first section the author is going to talk about is the Sephardi community and the Haroshona in Jerusalem. We know there was many Haroshona, chief rabbis of Jerusalem's different stages. Now the number of studies on Sephardi community to Jerusalem at the turn of the last century and in the first decade of the century remains very small, let's just say, even in Israel. I think there was a Sharabi's study. I'm not so sure where it is. I'll try and I'll show you the sources at the end in the thumbnail here on YouTube. I will try and put add the notes. I believe the Sephardi community itself, or the Sephardi Committee of Jerusalem in the end of the Ottoman period, which in perhaps, let's just say, is regarded as the first comprehensive monograph written in Hebrew from Sephardi viewpoint. The secret, let's just say, the scribes' difficulties in studying the Sephardi community in Jerusalem. Firstly, to the abandonment and scattering of materials and documents on the community, and secondly, I think there was communal conflicts at that point in time among the Jewish community. Namely, there was between both Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and also between Sephardim and Edut Mizrach. There was, let's just say, differences at that point in time. So I think the person explains that writers belonging to the subordinate Edut Mizrach tend to justify themselves for their own sake, and let's just say will not be less favorable, let's just say the terminology, to the Sephardi attitude towards him, the Spanish attitude towards him. In contrast, I think this tendency, there have been, I think, few academic studies, let's just say, from Sephardi points of view, according to the, I think the phrase that's written is a Sharabi. I think that's the actual title. Now, the author would say, thirdly, in relation to the communal, let's just say, conflicts, the author says it's hard to estimate the values of the memoirs written by those involved in the issue of affairs by themselves. Now, it's actually interesting. Sephardim settled in Jerusalem, the author states, under the patronage of the Ottoman Empire after being expelled from Spain in 1492. Obviously, we know that. And then, obviously, from Portugal, they were expelled also. So that was another key moment over there, which we have to, that will actually see the, let's just say, the rising at that point in time. I think that was in 1497. They were, obviously, the vast dominant Jewish community in Jerusalem from the 15th century, obviously to the end of the 18th century, and though there existed at that point in time other Jewish communities. Now, I think in the 19th century itself, Jerusalem, the yeshuv was composed of 3 Jewish groups of Ottoman subjects. I think that the first group was dominant Sephardim. The second was, as they state over here, the Mistarabim, this Arabized Jews, which is terminology, namely indigenous Jews who had lived in Palestine before the immigration of Sephardim and adopted Arab way of life and spoken Arabic. And then the third was, above mentioned, the Edut Mizrach Jews from Muslim countries, which we'll talk about. By the way, she's the author over here sourced everything. It gave about 30 sources at the end of the article. In addition to these groups, Ashkenazi community, they increased gradually in number, especially after the Egyptian rule in 1831 to 1840 in Jerusalem. According, I think, to someone named Gat, Sephardim had been the majority of the Yishuv in Jerusalem until 1872. But Ashkenazim exceeded 50% of the population of the Yishuv in Jerusalem in 1875 and then reached 60% by 1877. The Yishuv would go on to enter a new stage of its history with the arrival of Zionist immigrants from Russia. Most of them obviously were from Ashkenazi descent. After, I think there's unfortunate pogroms that actually took place in 1881, these new waves of immigrants were, let's say, very, very different to way of life from the old Ashkenazi community also, which was composed of traditional Orthodox Jews such as Perushim and Hasidim. This new community was, let's just say, compromised of modernized secular Zionists who denied the traditional way of life to these religious East European Jews that had heard for hundreds of years. These differences obviously caused serious communal conflicts between the community, the Yishuv Yashan, as they say, and a new community, the Yishuv Hadash, among the Ashkenazim themselves. Now, the Sephardi rabbis in Jerusalem, however, were in general foreign in these communal disputes between the old Yishuv. and the new issue among Ashkenazim, though some of the Sephardi, let's just say, intellectuals were affiliated to the Tnuat Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, and even to the Zionistic movement, because I think the author quotes over here, Halper explains, despite their adherence to religious observance, the Sephardim worldview, infused with flexibility and synthesis, did not preoccupy the Ashkenazic one. Now, the attitude of the Sephardi rabbis and rich merchants towards Zionism is characterized by indifference. Between changes had no transcendent meaning in and of themselves. They either contributed to the fundamental realities of economic, social, and political life, or did not, let's just say. For Sephardim, though, the thought, for example, of nationalistic terms, it would never have occurred to any of them that, let's just say, over here, Ottoman rule might or should end, let's just say, in of itself. Now, Sephardim continued to be the terminology the author uses, aristocratic, as members of an official millet under Ottoman administration, and also to embody a typical, let's say, way of life and values in Islamic society, at least under the collapse of the empire in World War I. They, however, became divided and weakened on their fragile power base with the decline of the empire itself in the face of the European intervention. Now, also, the author quotes Gatt again, describes the Sephardi community in the 19th century as follows. In the Sephardi community, there were big distinctions among different strata. Most of the rich and well-to-do in the Jewish community were Sephardim over there, but the more poorer people and needy people existed only in the community. The most important stratum was that of rabbis who were distinguished from others by their special dress and acquired the highest respect from the community members. At the top of the strata stood the rabbis. Below them were the merchants and well-to-do, and on the bottom lay the, let's just say, the more unfortunately poorer people, let's just say. Now, the title of Rishon LeZion, the chief rabbi, let's say, is said to have dated back to the latter half of the 17th century. Now, I must stress there's also places I've read myself, just to add my 2 cents. Even in the 1500s, there was a chief rabbi of Jerusalem that had like a similar status to the Rishon LeZion, respectively. Now, it's interesting. I believe the spiritual authority of the chief rabbi in Jerusalem, whose title was called the Rishon LeZion, went beyond Palestine. Questions in halachic Jewish law and spiritual guidance were asked of them from all over the diaspora communities. So it was a really chashuv position, respectively. The man elected as the Rishon LeZion had to be a great scholar who gained high reputation for his learning and his way of life, and also had to acquire experience in the community administration before he attended a high position of the rabbinate, respectively. Now, every case, I think, for the Rishon LeZion had to go abroad to an emissary to the diaspora to get his position in order to encourage the diaspora communities to send money to support Yishuv, let's just say, or to give them spiritual guidance. All the Ottoman Jewish subjects belonged to the Jewish millet at that point in time, whose chief was the Chacham Bashi of Istanbul. Remember, Istanbul also had a very rich Jewish heritage with regards to the line of chief rabbinate. He was authorized to represent the Jewish communities in the empire by the Sublime Porte. Every request to the Porte had to be passed through the Chacham Bashi of Istanbul, and all the rabbis in various areas in empire were legally subjected to him. Now, such a situation, the author writes, changed with Tanzimat. That was Ottoman administrative informs. And the declaration of legal equality between Muslims and Dhimmis, non-Muslims, let's say, Christians, let's just say, and Jews, and also the raising of the legal status of Jerusalem in administration brought about the appointment at that stage in time of an independent Chacham Bashi in Jerusalem. Now, this independent was separated from other areas in empire at that point in time. After the independence, the Chacham Bashi of Jerusalem, who served as Rishon LeZion concurrently, became the authorized representative of the Jewish community in Jerusalem. This administrative change, let's just say, concerning non-Muslims, especially the Jews in Jerusalem, was caused by the mounting activities of foreign countries, of foreign consulates in Jerusalem, which encouraged, let's say, at that point in time, the Ashkenazi Jewish community to be under the patronage of consulates and gave them their nationalities, let's just say, in itself. The Porte intended to counterbalance the Sephardi subjects against foreign Ashkenazi subjects, as they were a growing community at that point in time. Now, the separation of Kolim from Sephardim the relationship now we're going to speak, the author is going to speak, between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Now, obviously, as we stated before, the Sephardim were the old inhabitants of Jerusalem, many of whom immigrated not only from Iberian Peninsula, but from Asia Minor and Balkan areas during the Ottoman period, while Ashkenazim were newcomers from Russian territories of Eastern Europe. Now, the former spoke Ladino, obviously, the Spanish dialect written in Hebrew letters, as well as Arabic, while the latter spoke Yiddish, a German dialect written in Hebrew letters, but ignorant of Arabic they happened to have been. And now Eliav, the author has commented over here, comments on the language problem for both of them, that every Sephardi became accustomed to Arabic dialect of native inhabitants in Jerusalem by himself for a short time, let's just say. This knowledge enabled them to have contact with non-Jews easily. Contrarily, it was difficult for Ashkenazim to learn Arabic, obviously, which was completely foreign to them. It was indicated on many occasions that the reason for economic difficulties Ashkenazi immigrants faced was ignorance of the local tongue at that point in time. But in time, they acquired the basics of Arabic by themselves. So at first, Arabic was used as a language for communication between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. In the latter half of the 19th century, that was. However, Hebrew had become the language of communication between two communities a few decades before, obviously, the coming of Eliezer ben Yehuda in 1857 to 1922. Now, it's interesting, there was two communities were different from each other in many respects, such as clothing, houses, way of life, and version of prayer, obviously. Also, within regards to halakhic point of view, Jewish law and religious customs. Moreover, the principle, obviously, the confrontation between them was economic. One, namely, I think the author states of it, the halaku, which was financial allowance for the support of inhabitants of the land of Israel from the contributions of the co-religionists in the, let's say, diaspora. Owning to, I think at that point in time, the central and special position of Jerusalem is a religious and national consensus of the Jewish people. In Jerusalem, Sephardim, they monopolized the halakha, the money, even in the face of an increasing, let's say, Ashkenazi population in the 19th century. The discontent of Ashkenazim against Sephardim, let's just say, burst out with the aspirations for establishing their own independent kollel, or kollelim, as they state out, which was Ashkenazi communal organizations according to country or religion or region or origin. Now, the organizational independence of Ashkenazi kollelim began in 1830 at the point in time. The formation of many kollelim was characteristic of Ashkenazim, not Sephardim. Why did Ashkenazim desire to establish their own communal organizations there? Now, the Ashkenazim, they actually did ask Sephardim to grant them two requests. At that point in time, this is what the author says. The first request was the Ashkenazi right to receive the halukah, the money sent from their own Ashkenazi communities in Europe. The second was the exemption of foreign Ashkenazim from Ottoman taxes under the protection of European consulates. But both of them were contrary to the Sephardi interests at that point in time. The first demand originated from the difference of economic weight, the halaku, the money in daily life between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Now, Sephardim consider it to be used for communal purposes over here. That is for support of scholars who learn Torah and Talmud, and also for the assistance of poor and needy. Now, the Sephardi establishment, including rabbis, did not, let's just say, in of itself, the halakha money, but on other sources such as a commercial in of itself. On the contrary, as for Ashkenazim, the halakha money was, I think, distributed equally to individual families according to number, even though they were rich at that point in time. Most of the Ashkenazi immigrants lived heavily on halakha money. It meant that halakha money was more essential for Ashkenazim than for the Sephardim at that stage in time. Ashkenazim therefore struggled for more halakha distribution in order to live in Jerusalem. The author actually quotes all these different happenings also at the end of this specific well-detailed article. Now, in addition, there was special, let's just say, emissaries, or let's say rabbis, or shluchei de rabbanan, they call it shadar, were sent to Ashkenazi communities by Sephardi rabbinate so as to collect this money. Ashkenazim themselves were not authorized to collect money without commission of the Sephardic rabbinate. The second request concerning taxes resulted from the fact that Ashkenazim were not Ottoman subjects, but foreigners in Jerusalem under the protection of European consulates. On the religious level, they belonged as the believers of Judaism to the Sephardi rabbinate as, let's just say, formal Ottoman institution, when they immigrated to Palestine. On the level of nationality, however, they were exempted from more of the Ottoman taxes as foreigners, according to the capitulations in of itself, respectively. Over here, Sephardim, however, ordered Ashkenazim to pay the taxes on Jewish religious matters on many occasions, such as inheritance, burial, slaughter for the kosher meats, and so on. This was reported over in this article we're using, I think, which connected, I think, from notes in the Ben Tzvi Institute and Hebrew University. The momentum to encourage the communal independence of the Perushim, many of whom had become the British proteges, were given by Lord Charles Napier. I think he lived between 1796 to 1860. The British admiral, whom in, I think, 1840 to 1841 had driven the Iberian Pasha out of Palestine. Come with the year 1856, he acquired Firman, the Sultan's degree, from the Sublime Porte to rebuild an old synagogue, the reconstruction of which had not been permitted for a long time on a historical site called the Hurvul. I think it was ruin, where an Ashkenazi synagogue had existed in the 17th century. And what's interesting, the reconstructed Ashkenazi synagogue became a communal center of Perushim in Jerusalem. In addition, we can see this over here, to the renewed center, Perushim succeeded in securing over large proportions of the Halakha funds originating in Europe, that giving them an independent financial base, thanks to Tzvi Hirsch Leheren. He lived between 1784 to 1853. He was a very wealthy man, I believe, in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. The communal conflict then would reach a peak, I think, with the establishment of the General Committee, the Chabad HaKelali of Ashkenazi Kollelim in 1867, whose purpose, let's say, were to coordinate and manage problems common to all the Kollelim, especially governmental taxes, to give the halukah to divorced families, and to assist individuals of the Kollelim. All Kollelim, including Perushim and Hasidim, took part in the unified committee at that point in time. Now, given this opportunity, both Ashkenazim won de facto communal independence from Sephardim, thanks to aid of European consulates in Jerusalem, even though many problems concerning religious matters still remained unsolved. By the 1860s, there were 19 Ashkenazi Kollelim in Jerusalem, separated from Perushim. Now, the relationship between Sephardim and Edut Mizrach, let's explore that over here. I'm just using this article over here, very, very historic, very rare article over here. I think the author has sourced everything also at the end of the article. Jewish immigrants to Palestine from other Muslim countries increased after Muhammad Ali's rule in Palestine. Among those who immigrated were the Ma'arabim. This was from Maghreb community of Morocco. There was also the Gurjim from Georgia, the Parsim from Persia, and Bukharim from Bukhara of Central Asia, and the Temanim from Yemenite, and so on. These communities were under the patronage of the Sephardic rabbinate after they immigrated. That's what's reported over. Now, what's interesting, I think the Arabim were the first Oriental community in Jerusalem to establish their independent religious institutions, I think around the time period of 1860 or 1866. Until then, I think the Meravim had struggled against Sephardim for communal independence as Kollel for decades. Some Meravim were Ottoman subjects, I believe, and others were, I think, French or Spanish nationality. They were different from Sephardim in many respects of life and religious traditions. Their population reached 2,000, I believe, which was about 7% of the Jewish population and 25% of the Sephardim in Jerusalem in 1897, I believe. The turning point, I believe, for the Maravim was the immigration of Rabbi David Ben Shimon. He was also called the Dvash. I think he wrote the book, the Tzufat Dvash, from Rabat. He was in 1854. He was highly respected in the Jewish community of Morocco. When he immigrated to Palestine, many disciples followed him. The immigration made Maravim, at a more rapidly increase in the number in Jerusalem. Among disciples were highly respected Chachamim, scholars, in the eyes of Sephardim. So it became easier, let's just say, for the Maravim to succeed in establishing independent Kollel. Rabbi Ben Shimon had devoted himself to the Maghrabi community until he passed away, I think, in 1880, according to Bernai. So Bernai is another source that's written over here, used also for this very, very detailed article over here. Now, the Maravim and Sephardim reached the first agreement, I think, called the Besher or Hesher, or solution, as you can say, at the time, in 1860, in which partial communal, let's say, autonomy from the Sephardi rabbinate was ensured, they renewed their agreements in 1874 and 1884. Now, in agreement, the Maravim confirmed the authority of the Sephardic rabbinate. They were entitled to get some percentage of the halukah money from abroad, to send their own emissaries to Morocco with Sephardi approval, and also establish their own independent communal court, a Bet Din, a Jewish court. In this sense, the communal situation of the Maravim in relation to Sephardi rabbinate was similar to that of Ashkenazim. The second community to establish their own kollel in, let's just say, the Eidut Mizrach was a Georgian community, following the Moroccan precedent. Let's just say there was a partial independent of Sephardim in 1863. Now, the Persian and Yemenite communities were similar to each other in composition of new immigrants. There were many poor people with a large family in both communities reported over. They therefore strongly, let's just say, they questioned the Sephardi rabbinate for not fulfilling, they felt, their duty at the time towards Eidut Mizrach, insisting that the Sephardi rabbinate did not take care necessarily, as well as they could have, of maybe poor people over there and the people that were needy. And so the article says, but it consumed the money, let's say, sent from the native lands of Persia and Yemen for Sephardi own purpose, respectively. Now, the Persian immigrants increased, especially, I believe, after the 1860s or 1890s, I think it was. Now, I think at that point in time, their number reached 1,200. Come what the year 1909, so that was a large number. Obviously, there's much more now, obviously, in modern day. But many of them lived, unfortunately, in tight situations with regards to food. They didn't have much. They lived in small huts. The article said tinned huts. Now, some of them named Raphael Chaim HaKohen. I'm not sure. I think he was a rabbi. I think he lived between 1883 to 1954. I'm not sure if it was rabbi or not. From Shiraz, initiated the established a society of the Persian community called the Harat or Beit Yon Le'idut Yehudi Paris Biurshleim, I think in 1898. This society helped poor Persian immigrants in social and educational affairs. Now, it's interesting. I think the Hebrat of Eitzion had to negate at that time, let's just say, with the Persian consulate of Jerusalem on the matter of heavy passport tax, and also face Ottoman orders to be deported due to their Persian nationality. That's what's reported over. Persians did not succeed in being independent of Sephardim until the First World War, in spite of the Hebrat of Aveit Zion's efforts. Now, as for the Yemenite Jews over there, they immigrated en masse from Sana'a to Palestine in 1882. They did. Let's just say with their leader, Rabbi Shalom al-Sheikh. I think he was a great rabbi. He lived between 1859 to 1944. Now, the Yemenite population in Jerusalem reached 450 in 1885, and as many as 2,500 in 1908. They also lived, let's say, a more poorer life in the Holy Land when they immigrated. But someone named Israel Frumkin, who lived between 1850 to 1914, who was editor of Hebrew newspaper Havatzelet, initiated the establishment of a charitable society, Ezrat Nitim, in order to settle poor Yemenite Silwan Shiloh near the old city of Jerusalem. Now, the Yemenite Jews, as Ottoman subjects, were confronted with Sephardi rabbinate on many occasions, especially on economic problems such as the halukah, the distribution and the heavy burden of the Babal Asharai, the tax for the release from military service as non-Muslims imposed by the Ottoman authorities. They did not, however, succeed in being separate from the Sephardi rabbinate completely. In contrast, however, let's say, to the poor Persian and Yemenite communities, I think the Jewish community was relatively rich thanks to the Russian rule, I think at that point in time, during the second half of the 19th century, and was also on good terms with the Sephardi rabbinate. Now, the Bukharians over here, the Bukharian community, they made a large donation to Sephardi rabbinate and even accepted the Sephardi religious rites through the Sephardi emissaries in Bukhara. The Sephardi rabbinate often sent its emissaries to Bukhara after the 1880s in order to collect the halukah money over there. Both of, I think, let's just say, both of them therefore cooperated with each other thereafter. A relatively large number of Bukharian Jews reached Jerusalem in 1871 after the Russian conquest. It was the Russian rule of Asia enabled the Bukharian Jews to immigrate to Palestine by sea through Odessa and the Black Sea. Moreover, the Hovei Tzion, the lovers of Tzion, that's what you translate this organization as. The movement of the Russian Jews encouraged more immigration of the Bukhara Jews to Palestine, which is another very interesting tidbit. Now, I think in the 1880s and the 1890s, it was the Bukharians established their own quarter outside the old city of Jerusalem, so the Bukharian quarter. Through the population was not so large. In 1891, the Bukharian population in Jerusalem was now 500, and then reached 917 in 1913. The mutual cooperation between the Bukharian and Sephardi Jews were halted. There was more inner strife in the Sephardi community over the office of the Hacham Bashi in Jerusalem. Come what 1912, the Bukharian Jewish people, they established their own religious institution, while they would continue also at the same time to consider Sephardi Hacham Bashi to be the official religious representation of their own community. Now, I think there was in a debate, let's just say, in the Sephardi community at the end of its hegemony. This was before the First World War. Now, the Sephardi community, I'm just reading this article over here, which I found on the internet, which is very, very detailed. The Sephardi community was split. There was robust debate over the post of Hacham Bashi. I think after Rabbi Yaakov Shaul Elisha, who was also called the Yisabracha, very, very great rabbi. He lived between 1817 to 1906. I think he was a chief rabbi between 1893 to 1906. He passed away in 1906. The chief rabbi, Rabbi Elisha, learned in the Torah and Talmud, succeeded as Hacham Bashi in 1893 from his father-in-law. His father-in-law was Rabbi Raphael Meir Hanigel, who passed away in 1893. Now, Rabbi Elisha was respected by both Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and even by the heads of other communities. Now, after Rabbi Elisha passed away, there was a struggle over office, let's just say, with Hacham Bashi, and it began in the Sephardi community. And obviously, it would, let's just say, at that point in time, it would continue until 1921, when the Council of the Chief Rabbinate of Eretz Israel, Harbunat Rishit, Eretz Israel, was established under British mandate. Now, I think, quoting again Sharabi over here, as a source over here, describes the inner strife, let's just say the inner debate, as follows: the severe and continual, let's say, a debate which erupted for the office of the Chacham Bashi in the Sephardi community deviated from inner communal nature and caused both forth repercussions among all circles of Yishuv and also abroad. In the discord were involved all sections of the Yishuv, the Sephardim, the Ashkenazim, the entrepreneurs, the rabbis, the chief rabbi, let's just say, of Istanbul, the Alliance Israelite Universal, and the Ezra Society, and also consulates. Now, local newspapers also played roles, let's just say, maybe towards discord, let's just say. Obviously, politics was always a big thing where come out, and seemingly at that point in time, there was in the Yishuv itself, there was real robust debate. The Sephardi community was, I think, polarized into two groups at that point in time, the Hacham Bashi. The first group was supporters of Rabbi Chaim Moshe Elisha. He was also called Chama. He passed away, I think, in 1924. He was the eldest son of the chief rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Shaul Elisha, respectively. That we have to point out over there. And there was also, obviously, Rabbi Chaim Elisha was one of the famous scholars and known as a businessman. We've spoken about it was a really great family, the Elisha family. The other group was supporters of Rabbi Yaakov Meir, another great rabbi. Happened to have been, he lived between 1856 and 1939. Now, interesting, I think Rabbi Yaakov Meir will actually have the chief rabbi role at a later stage of this. He was one of the Sephardi leaders, and he was more close, I think, to the Zionistic movement. He was familiar with many foreign languages, had broad knowledge, and also represented, let's say, a trend more in the Enlightenment approach of Hebrew. He spoke the language, let's just say, and he was among the Jews in the Sephardi community. So both of them have brilliant and very important qualities. So two camps were favorable for two different ways, which were both very positive. It was between, let's say, the conservatives and the, let's say, people that wanted to deviate a bit from the existing system. The conservative camp, let's say, made endeavors to maintain status quo in the Sephardi community. Rabbi Elisha was a candidate of the more conservative camp, let's just say, which reflected, the interests of the well-to-do and establishment people, the Anesei HaMismat in the Sephardi community. I think they were more scared of change of communal organizations, because organizational changes would deprive them of, let's say, economic profits from the halukah money, and let's say more control of the community leadership. This is what the article is saying itself. Now, among the supporters were traditional rabbis and the Sephardi council, such as Rabbi Yitzchak Ashkenazi. He lived between 1859 to 1916, and also Rabbi Chaim Aaron Valero. He passed away in 1922, born in 1854. He was, and I think, I'm not sure if he was a rabbi or not, Valero was, but he was an influential Sephardi black banker and an entrepreneur. In contrast, opponents persuaded a more modernized, let's just say, and organizational changes for Sephardi community. Obviously represented Rabbi Yaakov Meir, I think, let's say, the more enlightened intellectuals and Sephardi masses would have maybe favored this change itself and supported Rabbi Meir. Also, I think the Eidut Mizrach, the Oriental communities, such as Yemenites, Moroccans, Persians, Bahrains, and the Halabim, supported him also. They thought maybe change itself was needed, and maybe a reshuffle was needed at that point. And so Sephardic leadership will bring change within regards to the topic of halukah money, for example, and Sephardi attitude towards the Eidut Mizrach. So in fact, Rabbi Meir agreed, let's just say, with Yemenite Jews on the establishment of Yemenite Kollel independent of Sephardi rabbinate in exchange for their votes for him in the election of the Chacham Bashi. And this is very interesting, getting very political over here. So you can see both of them came with very great qualities and strong reasons. Now, among the supporters of Rav Meir was a Zionistic was a Sephardi Zionist, Avram Albert Antebi. He lived between 1869 to 1918, born in Damascus. Maybe we'll speak about him once each time. He was representative of the Alliance Israelite Universal and the Jewish Colonization Association in Jerusalem. He played an intermediate role between Zionists and the Sublime, let's say, port later. I think in September 1906, the first and sole election of the Chacham Bashi in Sephardi history of Jerusalem was held according to Ottoman law. And Rabbi Meir, I think, defeated Rabbi Elisha in the election. Rabbi Meir would be the Chacham Bashi at Jerusalem, and he would win by a majority of, I think, at that point in time, 80 votes in General Committee. That's what's reported over. I don't know how much of a majority it was of the Sephardi rabbinate. The result, however, had to be approved by the chief rabbi of Istanbul, and the Porte, the conservatives, let's say, and its opponents sent the petition of their claims over Rabbi Moshe Levi, the chief rabbi of Ottoman Empire, let's just say the Chacham Bashi in Istanbul. Consequently, the chief rabbi decided, acknowledging the claim of the defeated conservatives, that the election itself was invalid. Wow, so this will obviously cause maybe a stir over here at that point in time. The reason was that the Ashkenazim, or the Perushim and the Hasidim, the majority of the Yishuv, did not take part in the election of Chacham Bashi in Jerusalem. So the conservative Ashkenazi communities had been recognized as a de facto independent kollim, but continued to be the de jure subordinates, the Sephardi rabbinate, between Ottoman authorities. In addition, political considerations were reflected in the decision, because Rabbi Meir had close and intimate relationship also with Zionistic leadership at that point in time, but also with foreign consulates through his supporter Antebi, who was denounced, let's just say, as maybe not associated to the empire by the conservatives. Now, the new Ottoman Mutsarif, the governor in Jerusalem, the Ali Ekrem, I think, Bey, reached Jerusalem in December 1906 with the official instruction of the Chacham Bashi in Istanbul. Rabbi Meir was forced to leave his office at that point in time. He would go on to go to Saloniki and become a chief rabbi of the Chacham Bashi in Saloniki. Now, this, let's just say, strife that will turn out continued even after the dismissal of Rabbi Yaakov Meir. The chief rabbi of Istanbul appointed Rabbi Eliyahu Moshe Panijel. He passed away in 1919 as temporary acting Chacham Bashi over there. He was supported by the Sephardi conservatives and Ashkenazi communities. Rabbi Panijel, let's just say, tried to, let's say, weaken the Rabbi Meir campaign. He was said to carry out reprisal against Yemenite Jews who supported Rabbi Meir by imposing upon them. This was reported over, like more toughness, from tax's point of view. And this would go on at that point in time. Israel society was involved, the alliance in itself. I think a change of situation would occur with the Young Turks revolution in Istanbul in 1908. The chief rabbi Moshe Levi would leave his position as a Chacham Bashi in the empire, and correspondingly Rabbi Peniziel would leave the Chacham Bashi role in Jerusalem. And Rabbi Chaim Nachum, I think he lived between 1872 to 1960, was appointed the new Chacham Bashi of Istanbul and the opponents, let's just say, succeeded in gaining office of the Chacham Bashi in Jerusalem eventually. But this more robust debates would actually take place. I think from 1919, Rabbi Moshe Yehuda Franco, he lived between 1837 to 1918, from Rhodes entered Jerusalem as an elder arbitrator between the two camps. Rabbi Franco had retired from Chacham Bashi in Rhodes because of his older age. He reluctantly would accept office in Jerusalem, so that a recurrence of the inner strife, let's say debate, would be, let's say, thwarted, prevented. He was the sole and last Chacham Bashi appointed formally by Fearman since the death of Rabbi Elisha in 1906. In spite of his efforts to mediate between two camps, Rabbi Franco failed, let's say, in maybe totally vanquishing this. Now, after the First World War broke out in 1914, he had to concentrate on working for the Yishuv in order to, let's say, to collect money for the relief of Jewish families whose heads were enlisted in the Ottoman army. I think finally he retired in 1915. Rabbi Nissim Danon, who lived between 1874 to 1930, had held the Chacham Bashi until the end of the Ottoman Empire without any real authority, and without the honorary title of Rishon LeTzion. But we could say he was Rishon LeTzion also unofficially, or to some degree also. So the author over here is going to conclude the traditional Sephardi leadership could not necessarily adapt themselves. This is what the conclusion the author said, to the changing circumstances from the late Ottoman period to the British role after the First World War. Under British role, secular, let's just say, political social Zionists occupied the central and dominant positions in the community of Palestine, the old Yishuv and the new Yishuv under the Ottoman ancient resume, were unified into the Knesset Israel, under which the unified rabbinate was established with two chief rabbis. Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook, he lived between 1865 to 1935, who was appointed Ashkenazi chief rabbi without any difficulty, while it was more tricky it was to appoint the Sephardi chief rabbi, obviously because of the debate. Finally, Rabbi Yaakov Meir, the more Zionist-oriented, let's just say, I don't want to use opponent of the traditional Sephardi leadership, but wanted a bit more of a change of it, and he was a Chacham Bashi of Salonika, he was a chief rabbi of Salonika respectively, was appointed the first Sephardi chief rabbi in 1922. I think also Rav Nachman Betita would have a position a few years before as a Chacham Bashi. The exclusive hegemony of the Sephardi rabbinate of Yishuv was finally lost with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, while the rising secular and modernized political and socialist Zionists, namely the new Yishuv, had defeated not only the Sephardi hegemony but also the Ashkenazi old Yishuv in Palestine's political and strategic alliance with the British Empire, respectively. And the author concludes, the author expressed the gratitude to the Ben Tzvi Institute for the H.S. Truman and Research Institute of the Advancement of Peace, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the International House of Japan for this article. Now, the many notes are actually used, I think, from article. We'll just quote some of it over here because that's what we've used it from. So Avram Chaim was a researcher at Miskav Yerushalayim. Apparently he discussed extensively on the Sephardi community under British mandate. For example, I think he's got the Hayisam Ben Hamanhaja Hasfardit Yerushalayim Lebron Kwilit Yehudit B'Mizrahi Hatikun Ben Shtiya Milhamot Ha'olam Shavut Va'am. I think this was printed April 1978, if I'm not mistaken, over there. There's a man named Jeff Halper. He would write a writing between Redemption and Revival, the Jewish Yishuv of Jerusalem in the 19th century. I think it was in the Westview Press. Also, the name of the Sharabi was Rachel Sharabi. I think there was an article called the Hayishuv HaSfardi Biryushalayim, which was, I think, part of the Mishrad Habiton in 1989. I think on another note that's actually written in an article on the early stages of Sephardi settlement in Palestine, someone named Yitzchak Ben Tzvi of Eretz Israel would write something also. I think Yitzchak Ben Tzvi, the exiled and the redeemed, from Philadelphia, would write a publication on this, which is quoted. Then the Ben Zion Gat, that was the name of Gat, who we've quoted on a few occasions here in this video. Hayishuv HaYehudi Be'eretz Israel, I think 1840 to 1881. Now, within regards to the topic of which the author has spoken about, the disputes of new and old Yishuv, I think various different works was actually used. Special debate, I think, on the Cathedra, I think Yad Ben Tzvi and various other places also. I think Halpa is also quoted. And another note is stating over here, it's worthwhile indicating that Israeli researchers led to describe Sephardi society more as stagnant and backwards, perhaps, against the background of traditional Orientalism and Islamic societies, respectively, Old Yishuv and New Yishuv. Now, Gat is also quoted again for another resource here. Some of them name Mordechai Eliyav in the Eretz Yisrael, the Yishuv, B'ma'ah, I think of Jerusalem, is quoted. He wrote something in 1978 concerning a brief history and function of the Rishon LeZion, of Avram al-Malach, Harishon LeZion Biurushalayim, I think also. And there's more. I think the birthplace of Chambashi from 1842. They would actually list over here, quoted Avram Gagin from 1842 to 1848. Rabbi Yitzchak Kobo was between 1848 to 1854. Rabbi Chaim Abu Lafia will be the chief rabbi. This is what the source is saying over here. We're just quoting the sources. At the end of this article was written. He was chief rabbi. He was from Tiberias between 1840 to 1861. Rabbi Chaim Chazan was between 1861 to 1869. He was from Izmir. Rabbi Avram Ashkenazi was a Chambashi between 1869 to 1880. He was from Greece. Rabbi Raphael Panishiel was between 1880 to 1893. And Rabbi Yaakov Elisha was from 1893 to 1906 from Tzfat. Rabbi Eliyahu Panishiel from 1907, I think to 1921 it says over here. And I think it's quoted other places. I must note also, other places would say Rabbi Nachman Betito would also be, and I think another rabbi also, interim time periods. I think also quotes Eliyav again here in this article. Also the Halukah is actually information about it is brought down from the Jewish Encyclopedia, I think, which is written down, I think, pages 1207 to 1216 respectively. They quote a source in regards to the Kolelim, I think quoting Gat again within regards to that. Now, the sources within regards to Ashkenazi Kolelim was as follows. I think the Purushay Kolelim, Kolel Hod 1830, I think it was in Holland and Germany. The Kolel Warsaw, I think, was 1845. Kolel Shomri Shamot was in 1858 from Hungary. Kolel Minsk from 1856. Kolel Lamza was from 1856. Kolel Slonim and Kolel Kolim and various other Kolim also. I think Yeshua Keniel or the Mabakim in Irguyim is actually quoted here. They quote that, they reference Gat on several occasions, and Keniel and Halpa. I think another person that's quoted in this article is someone named Yeshua ben Arieh, who was in Jerusalem, I think in the 19th century, in the Old City. I think the Ben Tzvi Institute also. Rachel Shrabi also again is quoted here. And I think on the Yemenite community, and various other people are also quoted. She quotes in the article, the author quotes, on the Yemenite community in Jerusalem, there were many works by Yemenite researchers such as Yehuda Nini and Yosef Tobi, apparently. The most recent and comprehensive study, I think, was Daranas. So that's also very, very interesting. And the quotes also, once again, Shrabi on various occasions also, and various other people. But I thought this would be an informative article within regards to the history of the Sephardi community in pre-World War I, especially from the 1800s. Changes actually took place at that point in time with different communities coming in and changing shapes of the world. Please, everyone, subscribe to the channel. If you've watched this, another informative class, subscribe and watch over. We actually record videos of the famous Oriental Sephardi Ancient Mizrach rabbis of yesteryear here on this channel, and we're trying to learn about the whole history of yesteryear with regards especially to the Spanish Oriental communities. So on that note, wishing you all a fantastic day. Thanks for spending time to watch, and take care. Thank you.